You're welcome to today's lecture. Today we'll be talking about the circle of Willis. Now, the circle of Willis involves the internal carotid artery and the vertebral artery. Internal carotid artery and the vertebral artery. We usually have two internal carotid artery and two vertebral artery. Now, these arteries actually lie in the subarachnoid space, and their branches are anastomosis and lie on the inferior surface of the brain. Now, the vertebral arteries, like I said, are two. They usually they pass through the transverse foramina. They pass through the transverse foramina of the cervical vertebrae, ascend upward to form what is known as the posterior inferior cerebellar artery. The posterior inferior cerebellar artery is also known as PICA. PICA means posterior inferior cerebellar artery. We also have posterior inferior cerebellar artery here. Now, the posterior inferior cerebellar artery also gives rise to a branch which is known as the posterior spinal artery. So this is called posterior spinal artery. Now, the vertebral artery goes upward, and as it goes upward, it forms, it gives rise to two branches that unite together. They join together to form another branch, which is known as, this one is known as the anterior spinal artery. Anterior spinal artery. This is anterior spinal artery. The anterior spinal artery runs through the anterior median fissure of the spinal cord. The vertebral artery goes upward and unites to form what is referred to as the basilar artery. So this is known as the basilar artery. Basilar artery. Now, the basilar artery has several branches, one of which is known as the anterior inferior cerebellar artery. So this one is known as anterior inferior cerebellar artery. The same, we have the same thing here, anterior inferior cerebellar artery. Now, another branch of the basilar artery is known as the labyrinthine artery. This one here is called labyrinthine artery. Labyrinthine artery. If you don't call it labyrinthine artery, you can call it internal acoustic artery. The basilar artery also have smaller branches, which are called the pontine arteries. So all these are called the pontine arteries. Pontine arteries. Or we can call it the pontine branch of the basilar artery. Now, we have another branch of the basilar artery that is known as the superior cerebellar artery. This is called the superior cerebellar artery. So we normally have two cerebellar arteries. We have the superior cerebellar artery and the inferior cerebellar artery. The inferior cerebellar artery is two. We have the anterior inferior cerebellar arteries, and then we have the posterior inferior cerebellar artery. Now, the basilar artery terminates as the posterior cerebral artery. Here is also another one, the posterior cerebral artery. Now, we also have the internal carotid artery, and of course there are two. The internal carotid artery has a branch which is known as the ophthalmic artery. Call it the ophthalmic artery. And then it has another branch which is known as the middle cerebral artery, and of course it has another branch called the choroidal artery, anterior choroidal artery. There are smaller branches that emerge from the middle cerebral artery, which are known as the lenticulostriatal artery that supplies the basal ganglia. Then there is another one that arises from there's another branch of the internal carotid artery that is known as the anterior cerebral artery. The anterior cerebral artery. The anterior cerebral artery are two, and they are connected by what is referred to as the anterior communicating artery. So the anterior communicating artery connects the two anterior cerebral artery. The posterior communicating artery connects the internal carotid artery and the posterior cerebral artery. Now, the anterior cerebral artery actually lies in the medial aspect of the cerebral cortex. In fact, it runs through the medial longitudinal fissure and supplies the medial aspect of the cortex. Now, let me draw the cortex here. So, the anterior cerebral artery lies in the medial aspects. It supplies the medial aspects of the cortex. It supplies the medial aspect of the cortex. The middle cerebral artery runs through the lateral fissure of the brain and supplies the lateral aspects of the cerebral cortex, whereas the posterior cerebral arteries actually supplies the posterior part of the cerebral cortex, which is known as the occipital lobe. That is to say that it comes down here. This is the posterior cerebral artery. It comes down here to supply the posterior part of the brain, which is the occipital lobe. And then, of course, the pica actually supplies the posterior inferior part of the cerebral area, and then the anterior inferior cerebellar artery supplies the anterior inferior aspect of the cerebellum, and of course the superior cerebellar artery supplies the superior aspect of the cerebellum. It supplies the superior aspect of the cerebellum. The pontine artery supplies the pons. It supplies the pons. The labyrinthine artery actually goes to the labyrinth. Now, it is also important to know the origin of the internal carotid artery and the origin of the basilar artery. The internal carotid artery actually arises from the aorta, and then the vertebral artery actually arises from the subclavian artery. Let me illustrate it on the board. Now, this is the diagram of the heart. This is the diagram of the heart, and this is the aorta. Of course, the aorta gives rise to the left subclavian artery, and of course, we have the left common carotid artery. Of course, the common carotid artery has what we call the carotid sinus that bifurcates into two, giving rise to the internal carotid artery and also the external carotid artery. Then on the right side, we have the brachiocephalic trunk. The brachiocephalic trunk divides into two, forming the right subclavian artery and the right common carotid artery. Of course, the right common carotid artery has carotid sinus, which bifurcates into two, giving rise to the internal carotid artery and, of course, the external carotid artery. Now, the vertebral artery actually arises from the subclavian artery. It arises from the subclavian artery and goes behind the internal carotid artery and lies there. Of course, it unites to form the basilar artery. So the internal carotid artery lies anteriorly, and the vertebral arteries actually lies posteriorly. The internal carotid artery actually gives rise to, it supplies 80% of the blood that enters the brain, and then the vertebral artery supplies, it gives rise to 20% of the blood that enters the brain. Thank you for listening. I hope to see you in our next class. Thank you.